Tuned in to News and Views with myself, Salilo Makwidi. The time is 26 minutes past 9. And in a bit, we'll be joined by Professor Patrick Bond. He's a distinguished professor of sociology and is a political economist and also a political ecologist and scholar of social mobilization. And we'll be speaking on an energy embargo for Palestine protests, which will be taking place on the 22nd of August at 12 p.m. And we'll be chatting with him just to understand a bit further on South Africa's relationship when it comes to, whether it's coal or any kind of other fuel exports that we have to Israel, and if those can be, I don't know, in a way, have an embargo put on them. Patrick Bond is joining us via our virtual platform. Professor Bond, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure chatting to you.
Assalamu alaikum. It's great to be with you, Salalo.
Thank you so much. I think if you can just maybe paint a picture for us when it comes to South Africa and the relationship that we have when it comes to exporting our fuels or any kind of commodities with Israel. Where are we? How big of an exporter are we with them? Are we essentially fueling this genocide that they are perpetuating against the people of Palestine?
It's a terrible confession, but that in spite of a good performance at the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, going into the judicial system and mobilizing the awareness that Israel is committing a genocide and that the apartheid regime in Israel is illegal and that the occupations represent colonial land theft. All of that South Africa has done well, but we would have to confess we've been weak on where boycott, divestment, sanctions, where economic interests are at stake. And just quickly, our exports to Israel include not only a massive amount of coal, over 500,000 tons a year consistently, but also diamonds. We send out raw diamonds, and regrettably, we import polished diamonds from Israel. And then thirdly, grapes from the Western Cape. And that's usually in the March, April, May season when Israel needs to import grapes. And though I think the overall economic relations have declined, and one example being El Al, the Israeli airline, used to run quite regular flights, and a few weeks ago they canceled their Johannesburg-Tel Aviv shuttle. But unfortunately, coal is probably going to become most vital because in Colombia, the number one coal exporter, the president, Gustavo Petro, announced in June that he anticipates cutting the coal supplies to Israel. And the number two exporter is Russia. South Africa, traditionally the third largest. This year, we've also seen the US, China, even a bit from Turkey, although Turkey has a leader, Erdogan, who did commit to full economic sanctions, although those are being, sort of avoided. But I think the main problem is how we get our society to recognize that there are profits being made by some really, let's say, objectionable companies. And the one that's being targeted by BDS and the Palestine Support Committee, all of the groups that we'll see out, climate groups, community groups, is Glencore, based in Switzerland with very strong South African connections.
I think when something like this, the topic of disinvestments and boycotts always comes up, especially when it comes to South Africa, is the fact that South Africa is in a very, very precarious position when it comes to its economy and how stable it is and the amount of jobs that are in the country that are going around. I think the Stats SA released, their quarterly stats about unemployment in the country, and it's staggering. More than 40% of South Africans are unemployed. The question is, where do you draw the line between, your own economy and stability and keeping jobs in the country, but also fulfilling that responsibility of, boycotting the state of Israel economically and cutting ties, like the exports of, our commodities to them and our imports? How do you respond to that? Which one means more than the other? And is there a middle ground between the two?
Oh, I think there is, Sadelo. I think the middle ground comes from what's called a just transition. And in discussions with the National Union of Mine Workers, NUM, I've certainly found them to be let's say, very critical of the existing system of a just transition, which hasn't worked because the corporate elite have been in charge of our climate policy. And unfortunately, that means workers and communities simply weren't consulted in the closure of Eskom's coal-fired power plant in Komati. We have to do it differently, and this is a very good opportunity. If coal mining jobs are lost, even though this is only 1% of South Africa's coal exports, the exports typically of over 50 million tons a year, and we're talking about just over 500,000 tons that go to Israel. Well, if any worker or any community is adversely affected, obviously the government should come in with a just transition to get us off our addiction to profiteering. And I say our advisedly because it's really a company, Glencore, at the lead, which also the leading company for exports of coal from Colombia. And on their board sit our own former Reserve Bank governor, Jill Marcus, and the CEO, the chief executive, Gary Nagle, both from Johannesburg. So both, well, what would you say? Because Jill Marcus had been Mandela's press spokesperson at one point and was head of Absa Bank. She's had her feet in both the corporate and political worlds, and I think political pressure on her, as well as the main beneficiaries of the Glencore relationship. And that's particularly Patrice Motsepe and his African Rainbow Minerals, a partner in many of the coal exports from South Africa, former partner of Glencore, Cyril Ramaphosa, in the Optimum mine that was so controversial and was raised in the Zondo Commission in accusations by Brian Molefe that Ramaphosa was corrupt on behalf of Glencore. The former Glencore leader, Ivan Glassenberg, had inherited what was then called Mark Rich and Company, which was doing apartheid sanctions busting back in the bad old days. And he himself was implicated in, let's say, vast corruption in Africa. In the DRC, he worked with Dan Gertler, the Israeli tycoon, in bribing and looting and pillaging countries in Africa, and paid huge fines a few years ago and had to resign. But Gary Nagle doesn't seem to be any different. This was raised with Glencore at their annual meeting on May 24 in Switzerland. They just gave it a complete disrespect. They didn't even entertain the question of whether Glencore coal exports to Israel are fueling genocide, which I think they very obviously are. And that's why on 22 August at noon, we'll all be out at Melrose Arch protesting at Glencore.
And just lastly, before I get so some of those final details about the protest, I think South Africa would be the perfect example of how boycott and divestment and sanctions can ultimately make a change when it comes to putting pressure on a regime, but for the younger generation it would be something very difficult to imagine that not buying a certain product or not having certain exports and imports from a certain country, in this case Israel, can make a significant change. Just paint a picture for us, and if you can quote some other examples of how the BDS movements have been quite impactful when it comes to putting pressure on a regime, and how in the Israeli case that can also be used to make sure that whatever transgressions that they are committing against the people of Palestine are ultimately in a way put to pressure to a point where we can see some kind of a ceasefire or anything that would resemble a positive outcome for the people of Palestine, people of Gaza.
Well, you're right, Celelo, to say we need pressure points because the diplomats, the international politicians have failed miserably. And there's an axis of genocide from Washington to London to Berlin to Brussels to Paris, back to Ottawa, Canada, and Tokyo. And of course, there's the allies of Israel within the BRICS, like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt. Even Brazil has military relations. India has very strong military and trade and also privatized port relations, as does China. So I think the BRICS will be one site for the BDS, let's say, debate to occur. You're right that we had extremely good success with BDS during apartheid. And here in Johannesburg, it was in September 1985 that South Africa had to default on foreign debt and close the stock market and impose exchange controls because of BDS in international finance, and it forced a break between the Afrikaner political elites in Pretoria and here in Johannesburg, the English-speaking capitalists, and they had to kind of break, and that was the sort of division that helped change the balance of forces. Another case being climate, where $60 trillion of investment funds have been announced for withdrawal from any coal, gas, or oil investments. That will affect South Africa's own attempts to go off of coal. And there's a debate about whether methane gas, which is more potent than CO2, should be adopted. And we're seeing these debates occur in ways that are profound. And I think consumer boycotts that you mentioned are vital. But let's also focus on the Achilles heel of Israel, which is energy, and South Africa's contribution, which is coal. The Houthis are basically making it impossible to take coal and oil and gas to Israel through the Suez Canal. And they've sunk Russian ships, Chinese ships with fossil fuels. And obviously we'd want a nonviolent, peaceful approach that will be something everyone in this country can endorse. And I hope putting pressure on the government to impose BDS, to also cut diplomatic relations, to prosecute South Africans who are fighting in the Israeli Defense Forces. All sorts of activities of that sort need to be pursued. BDS campaign here is doing a great job on it. And I hope we'll see people on August 22 at Melrose Arch, the Glencore South Africa headquarters, to really make the case, cut the coal ties between Glencore and Israel and stop fueling the genocide.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Professor Patrick Bond, always a pleasure chatting to you, and I'm sure we'll be having those details of that protest on our social media platforms, but we're going to leave it here for now. Really appreciate your time. Well, there you have it there, Professor Patrick Bond. And yeah, if you want to be a part of, I think, a very, very important, aspect of activism when it comes to that genocide that is perpetuated by the Israeli occupying forces, the energy embargo. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. It's almost mind-boggling, the fact that South Africa and the South African government are busy at the ICJ with the case, being at the forefront of advocating for the people of Palestine and their rights to self-determination, and to make sure that the state of Israel is held accountable for the ongoing genocide that they're perpetuating against the people of Gaza and people of Palestine. But then you have South Africa being the third largest coal supplier to Israel. Third largest. So essentially, South Africa is fueling and powering this genocide. Every time that the Israelis are using electricity, are manufacturing any kind of weapons that they're going to use in the mass destruction and the mass murder of the people of Palestine, people of Gaza, guess what? Their power stations are fueled by the coal that's coming out of South Africa. And it's a crazy concept, but we are there at the ICJ leading the case, saying these people are murderers. These people need to be held accountable. But again, we are sending them coal to continue this genocidal, this genocidal feat that they are imposing on the people of Palestine. So this is something that needs a lot of attention, because we can't be preaching one thing, but at the back end we are doing something totally different. So yeah, I think it's going to be a very, very interesting issue, the issue of an energy embargo on Palestine. That protest is on the 22nd of August at 12 p.m. At the Glencore coal headquarters. That's at 39 Melrose Boulevard in Sandton. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, one of my favorite segments of the show is hashtag Fired Up with Hafiz Imran Chunara. He's a personal excellence mentor and the CEO of Africa Muslims Agency. Fired Up is a segment where you get your daily dose of motivation from Imran Chunara. And the topic for today is growth. More on that after this break.